This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Francis Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the book of Exodus. I now want to deal with the final subject in the book of Exodus, and that is the sections dealing with the priesthood. I want to deal with the priesthood and the Sabbath, and then we are actually finished our reflections on this book. I mentioned to you before, and I'll have to do it again because there's overlap, that Exodus 25 to 31 and Exodus 35 to 40 have a lot of overlap, and there's no way out of escaping that, and it'll come up again today. I've already shown you that the plan of the tabernacle was that you go from the inner court where God resides to the outer court to minister to the people, and then you go from the outer court through the altar of sacrifice and the laver into the inner courts to meet God. And that dual movement actually required a priesthood in order to mediate between God and the congregation. This priesthood couldn't be given to Moses because Moses already had too much responsibility and he was the mediator. So the priesthood or the ministry that was required to keep God and the congregation together in good relationship had to be given to somebody else. And I want you to notice, and I will press the point as we're doing it, that the priesthood was actually given to Aaron and his sons. They did not have that in themselves. There was nothing in them that said they should be priests. It was something that was actually bestowed upon them. And this is actually an important point. Up to this time, when we were dealing with the book of Genesis, which I've already shared with you, for example, there was no priesthood. So I'm going to use maybe a dangerous language for a second, and that is to talk about lay priests, in inverted commas. And what I mean by that is that at the time of the book of Genesis, the male leader of the household acted as the priest for that family, or the male leader of a clan, or the male leader of a tribe, or Abraham, in lieu of all his descendants, could act as priest for their own group. Now, what we're going to deal with now is something completely different, and that is the priest will not be a member of your own house unless you happen to be of the tribe of Aaron. It will not just be your own clan or your own tribe. This priesthood is going to serve the whole congregation, the whole nation, the 12 tribes, and they will serve them regardless of any history that went on between the tribes. In other words, the priesthood is above politics, and it's above the interactions of the social sphere. God had to work out this system so that his holiness would not be violated by sinful human nature, and that he would be recognized and reverenced and worshipped as the all-holy God that he is, and that he would still be able to reach the unholiness that's in the people, and that they would be able to reach him, and therefore the altar of sacrifice was needed, and therefore a priesthood was actually needed. And the priest was somebody who had to be set apart. Now, the expression set apart is actually what is translated in English as holy. But in our everyday language in English, we use the term holy for something else, that there's sort of X amount of virtue or X amount of grace in a person, and they are holy. Anyone who is set apart for God's ministry is holy because your total concentration is on the divine and it's not on the human. So lay ministry from this point onwards is not acceptable. So what was okay at the time of the patriarchs is not going to be accepted now because God is doing a new thing. But you will find in later books like the book of Judges, when the people go through periods of losing faith, that they go back to the old thing. And sometimes you have an individual acting as priest in his own family. One particular example is given in the book of Judges, and that's a man called Micah, and he goes very far astray. So a priesthood that is chosen by God, the rules and regulations for their lives chosen by God, the way they are to do things chosen by God, all of this was given by God on the mountain. No wonder it took Moses 40 days to absorb all of this and to try and retain it, because from here on in, the emphasis is going to be on the exact obedience to whatever it was that God said to Moses on the mountain. If you look at the letter to the Hebrews, which I told you, you really need to examine the tabernacle at a much, much deeper level than I can give you in a general comment. Chapter 8 and verses 4 to 5, it says, "They are men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of the sanctuary in heaven." Now, I have reminded you before that if you look at the book of Revelation, chapters 4 and 5, that you get a vision of heaven and you see God on his throne and you see this sea of glass in front of him. And it is outside of that sea of glass that you meet the 24 classes of priesthood, and the congregation of all the blessed are outside of that again. And it's very interesting. Our churches were built like that until very recently. So there were two sides to the service that the priest had to do. One was to minister to God in the inner court, in the holy place, and the other was to minister to God's people out at the altar of sacrifice. And both of those were absolutely essential, but they were in two different directions. So they had to minister to God first. And one of the things that is given in absolute detail, I can't afford to read any of it or I won't be able to finish, is that they were to keep the menorah, the light of the holy place, alive. That light was to be continuous. It was to be a perpetual lamp. That perpetual lamp has been retained in the church, that we keep a light before the tabernacle. But unfortunately for us, the little light beside the tabernacle is so tiny that you have to be told it's actually there. We should have a large, noticeable light, and then everybody would know that it is pointing to the presence of God. And so the menorah was the constant reminder to the priests who would remind the people that God was actually present, okay? And that God is light, and the very first thing he created on the earth was light. And that in the New Jerusalem, I've told you this before, that the only light they would have would be the light of God. They wouldn't need the sunlight or the moonlight, and that the Lamb himself, that is the Redeemer, would be their light. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, for example, that Jesus says, "I am the light." And he repeats it again in chapter 9. And the light of Jesus, the reality of who he is, shone most completely in his passion and death. No matter what darkness and evil was thrown at him, the light of his love and his grace and his mercy absolutely triumphed all the time. That was what John said in the prologue of his gospel, that the darkness wouldn't be able to overcome the light. And that we learned from the Song of Songs in chapter 8 that love is as strong as death and as terrible as Sheol. And Jesus proved that on the cross. So it was in the darkest moments, in fact, that his light shone the greatest. And you find that throughout history as well, that it is in the darkest moments of history that you can see the saints much better than you would if everybody was good and everybody was holy. So they had to keep the perpetual lamp burning in the presence of God. And they also had to keep the perpetual sacrifice burning on the altar. Those two things had to be done because human nature is sinful and it is rebellious, and we fall constantly. If you're dealing with a large nation, the sacrifice needs to be offered all the time. And as I've already said to you, the holy sacrifice of the Mass is celebrated at every half hour and celebrated throughout the world. And it's to keep the judgment of God away from the sinfulness of man and to keep the forgiveness of God coming to us so that we wouldn't self-destruct in all our sinfulness. So Why couldn't we do this as individuals and not need any priesthood? Well, we were given a very, very good example in chapters 32 to 34 as to why we needed a priesthood that would actually keep the relationship between God and the congregation alive and well. And it was what happened as soon as Moses disappeared up the mountain, and the people fell right back into idolatry and immorality in the most dreadful manner. And even Aaron was part of that, as we know. And so because the people are, yes, they're coming to know the Lord, they have committed themselves to him, but they're not yet spiritually mature. And therefore, they do need actual help to get up from their falls and to come back to the Lord. And until we have completely surrendered to the will of God, this process of forgiveness and purification must actually continue. So the priesthood was needed to maintain this relationship between God and the people of God, and to keep grace and forgiveness coming towards the people. Listen to what St. James says in his letter in chapter 3 and verse 2 about Christians. Now, this is way over 1,500 years later, 400 or 500 years later. He says, "We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he's a perfect person, able to keep his whole body in check." So the priesthood is necessary. But you might ask the question, who heals the healer? Who takes care of the priest? What keeps the priest with his relationship with God and the congregation right? And the answer is the menorah. That if he's in the presence of the light of God on a daily basis, in other words, he's in the presence of God, we call that prayer. If his prayer life is right, he will be right. And so the priest ministering in the presence of the menorah, or the light in the holy place, that's what kept him going. With regard to who becomes a priest, we're definitely dealing with God's business here. Because before the time of the Exodus, as I said, it was just the male head of the family who looked after their own family or clan or tribe or whatever it was. But this is completely different now. God chooses his priests, and he chooses them for his own reasons. He didn't choose Aaron because Aaron was a good man. He chose Aaron to be the high priest after he was involved in the terrible debacle of the golden calf. And when you come to the New Testament, he didn't choose St. Paul because he was a saint. No. At the time he was chosen, he was a persecutor of the church, and he was trying to destroy the church. So God has his own reasons for calling. So let me read a little bit for you from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. Because, as I've said to you many times, this is actually a commentary on the whole tabernacle and its service. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God. They have to offer gifts and they have to offer sacrifices for sins. So that's the ministry in the outer court. He's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, because he himself is subject to weakness. So God chooses one of us, somebody who is like us. Aaron was actually like his congregation. Therefore, he would understand them. If God only chose saints who never fell to be our priests, the standard would be so high that the people would give up. But he chooses people like us who understand our weaknesses, and that's what the letter to the Hebrews is saying. He's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray because he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins. I'll point that out to you very clearly when it comes to the consecration of the priest, as well as for the sins of the people. No one takes this honour upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. And Christ himself, the writer says, didn't take this upon himself, the glory of becoming a priest. God said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he says in another place that you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, you should read on in that text because it tells you more and more about this priesthood of Christ, that his priesthood is of a much higher order than that of Aaron. it's only God who chooses the priest. He chooses him for whatever reason that he chooses him. He's not chosen because he's a saint, but he should become a saint as a result of his ministry. They don't all become saints because they're human beings like the rest of us. Okay. It is very important, therefore, that just because somebody is called to priesthood, that we don't put them on a pedestal and act as if they are some kind of divine being. That is not right. That doesn't help at all. And you'll get another wonderful reading in Hebrews chapter 7 from verse 11, telling you about the high priesthood of Jesus, which is of a much, much higher order than that of Aaron. And that is that he has this priesthood from Melchizedek, that mysterious figure. I'll have to go on, so I'll let you read that for yourselves. Now, the priesthood was not just given to Aaron as a person, it was given to the sons in his family. And initially, he has 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Unfortunately, Nadab and Abihu rebel against the Lord at a later stage and die tragically. And so Eleazar and Ithamar have to take over. So the next thing that the book of Exodus tells us about are the high priest's garments. And we have to realize that not only the tabernacle itself and the priesthood point to Christ. Now, unfortunately, Aaron is not a great pointer to Jesus as a priest, although he is the first high priest and Jesus is the great high priest. Hebrews 10:1 tells us that everything we're reading about here is a shadow of things to come. And Hebrews 9:9 says that they are a symbol of the present time. In other words, the present time is the time of Christianity, the time of the church. So the meaning of why we have a priesthood, why we have a perpetual sacrifice, why we have somebody keeping the congregation alive before God, why this person has to have special robes, why this person needs a very special consecration. It's all here. And because the priests were called to minister to God as well as the congregation, they were given privileges and authority that were not given to other people. And one of their privileges was physical closeness to the presence of God. Now, that physical closeness points down to our age, to the spiritual closeness that we are to have with God. The physical closeness they had was that they were operating in the holy place and God's presence was in the most holy place. So they were only inches away from the actual physical presence of God. But what the Lord is trying to tell us is that we are supposed to be living in the presence of God all the time. So they had to be vested with very special garments, which I'm going to go into, and their garments had to be consecrated as well as themselves, so that they knew that these garments belonged to God. It's the same with our priestly garments. Unfortunately, a lot of these wonderful garments have been dropped since the Second Vatican Council, and we have lost the significance of the special vestments of the priest. Thank God they still wear the alb. I'll explain it. So the priests themselves had to be consecrated, and all their garments had to be consecrated as well. And the letter to the Hebrews comments on that in chapters 5 and 7 that I've indicated. Exodus specifically says, and don't forget that what we're reading about comes directly from Moses, who came directly from God on the mountain, that the vestments of the priest were to bestow dignity upon his person. They were to bestow gravity upon his actions and to give him the authority to act between God and man. So very important functions. Of course, all of this was pointing down the centuries to the multiple perfections of the Christ. Now, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, you'll read about this in Leviticus 16, verses 3 and 4. On that day, he only wore a spotless white linen garment. And that spotless white linen garment indicated that he was approaching the immaculate, dazzling holiness of God, asking for forgiveness for the people. And so he approached the Ark of the Covenant, and so he was touching this dazzling holiness of God. And of course, this points down the centuries to the dazzling holiness of the Lamb of God who took away our sins. And of course, we read in John 19:23 that when Jesus approached the altar of the cross, where he was priest, victim, altar, and sacrifice, that he wore this white, seamless robe. This is extremely important. And that's why John brings out the fact that it was as they stripped Jesus for his death that they realized he was wearing the high priest's robe. That's a very important point to make. So altogether, there were 7 pieces in the high priest's garment. He had a breastplate. He wore a turban or a mitre, whichever you like to call it. And then the next thing is that there was a plaque in front of it saying, "Holy unto the Lord" on this plaque. It was a plate of gold. That's very important. And over the white garment, he wore a blue, because you know that the white now represents holiness and the blue represents heaven. And over that, he had a very decorative garment, which we call the ephod. Now, I'm going to illustrate this here. Here you have the high priest, and here you have an ordinary priest. Now, the ordinary priest is wearing the complete white linen and the decorative girdle, his authority to act as a priest. But the high priest is wearing the white linen garment as his undergarment. And then over that, he has the blue robe. And over that, this very ornate ephod. And this very ornate ephod, which looks like a skirt that is tied in the front, it was there to hold the breastplate on his chest. And there were 2 very precious onyx stones on his shoulders. And on these onyx stones, there were 6 tribes etched into each one of them, so that as the high priest walked into the presence of God, that literally the names of all the people of God were there in God's presence. So this is just showing you the back, that the ephod is there to actually secure the onyx stones and to secure the breastplate. I'll show you this in detail later. The breastplate was a very special thing, which was put into a very powerfully embroidered background. They were literally sewn into it, and they had 12 precious stones, each one representing one of the tribes of Israel. So at moments of gravity in their history, when the high priest went into the presence of God and wanted to know which tribe they were having the problem with, God would light up one of these stones. And therefore, you see an example of this in the book of Joshua, for example, and he discovers it's the tribe of Judah, for example, and then they will ask which clan, and then they will ask which family, and so on. And that's how they actually found the culprit when something went wrong. So all of these items of clothing were extremely important. The gold plaque that announced that he was holy unto the Lord, or separated for God's ministry, that was called the diadem. And the diadem is the first idea of what today we call a tiara. And it was the message, I don't know what the message of tiaras are today, but the message on the diadem of the high priest was that he was committed totally and completely to God. And so when the priest is dressed in this very important outfit, it means that he himself comes to terms with the gravity of his calling and the important authority that has been given to him. And so it actually helps him to enter into that situation that he's actually called to. It is very important. There was a second function to the diadem. It's very difficult to see it here because it's pictured in yellow. The second function was not only to declare that the priest was totally given to the Lord, but also that he was carrying in his person the shortcomings in all the worship that was going on. In other words, he was responsible before God for anything that was wrong in the worship of God, and therefore the priest had to offer sacrifices for himself and for the people. This was very important. So the reason for all of this elaborate vestment was that God could only do something that suited his own nature. And therefore, the only thing that could come into his presence was something that was pure and holy and true and real. And therefore, everything about the priest had to be stamped with holiness. Of course, all of this, as I said many times, is pointing to the fact that Jesus, while he was holiness personified, he was the one who bore our sins upon the cross. Now, the undergarment, you see it clearly in the ordinary priest. The undergarment is a white linen garment, pointing to the fact that he should live a holy life. In Psalm 132, verse 9, may your priests be clothed in righteousness or holiness. If you look back to the time of the Exodus, it seems a long time now, going back to the time in Egypt. But if you go back, you will find that the priests operating in the false worship in Egypt, they all wore white. They knew that coming into the presence of something otherworldly, that we are not fit for that at all. So on the white linen, then you have the blue robe, and the blue represents heaven, as you know, and it's worn over it. And I mentioned already that Jesus had worn the seamless robe. And then on the hem of this blue robe, they had fixed bells and tassels in the shape of pomegranates, so that whenever the high priest actually moved, it gave this little tinkling sound all over the place. This was actually quite important, certainly in the centuries later, when the high priest would be operating in the solemn temple of Jerusalem, that if he went into the Holy of Holies and something went wrong, like, for example, if he fainted or if he had a heart attack, nobody could go after him. So what they used to do is tie a rope around his ankle so that in actual fact, if something went wrong, all they could do was pull him out underneath the veil. They couldn't go in after him. The only person allowed into the presence was God. So the little musical sounds indicated that he was still moving and everything was okay. So the 12 tribes were actually present before God. They were present in two ways. One was on the shoulders of the high priest, and the other way they were present was on the breastplate. Now, the breastplate was also called a pectoral of judgment. Okay? We have an image of judgment as God punishing the earth, but that was not their image of judgment. Their image of judgment was that an oracle would be given by God, or a logion, or a word from God. And so people today still say to spiritual people, did you receive a word from God? That's a logion from God. So that is the importance of that. So the 12 precious stones represented the whole people of God. And there was a little pocket in behind, which I will talk about later. These meant that as the high priest stood in the presence of God, God could read the names as if he needed to read them, you know, and he could recognize who they were as if he needed that. This is our need, not his, okay? But you'll find that when you go to the fulfillment of this in the New Jerusalem, that the 12 precious stones are in the foundations of the New Jerusalem. Therefore, these precious stones are extremely important. It says, this is the foundation of the kingdom of God. And it is utterly precious to God. And the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem meant that this was utterly a work of heaven. It was God's own work. He alone could actually do it. As I mentioned just briefly, behind this, there was a little pocket it wasn't noticeable when the high priest was wearing the garment, and it's not noticeable even if you illustrate it by itself. And inside of that little pocket were two stones called the Urim and the Thummim. And these are very strange to us. They were two precious stones that were kept in this little bag hidden there. The Urim means something like light or fire, and the Thummim means something like perfection. We're not absolutely sure why they were called that. But they were used to get enlightenment from God regarding his divine will about grave matters in the nation, but they were used as lots. So whenever the high priest needed an answer or an oracle from God, he would pray and he would ask God. And then when enough time had been given to receive some kind of a response from God, he would put his hand into this thing and take out one of those stones. And the answer was either yes or no. If you go to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1 and verse 26, you'll find that the people of God were still using that method when the apostles chose Matthias to replace Judas. They also used lots, but they asked God ahead of time to actually guide them. Since the function of the priest was so important, he himself as a person needed to be consecrated and all his robes needed to be consecrated. And this is a long process that is described, and all I'm going to do is summarize it for you, and you can read it yourselves. This was the ritual of induction into the priesthood, and it lasted 7 days. In other words, it was very solemn. And during those 7 days, Aaron and his sons, 4 sons, had to live in the holy place for the 7 days. They were not allowed to leave it. They had to stay in the presence of God for the 7 days. In other words, we would call it a retreat, that they had to go away from the world and from everyday life for this process. During this time, Moses was the consecrator because he was the mediator between God and man. So he was doing all the actions for God that God wanted to do to these men. And during the whole process of the 7 days, Aaron and his sons are passive. Moses is the one who is giving authority, giving this, giving that. They are the ones receiving authority, receiving this mission. So they are completely passive throughout the whole thing. 7 things were done to them. Notice that number 7 keeps turning up, the number of perfection. First of all, they were taken from the nation or summoned from the nation. And this was their election by God. Now, of course, they knew about it ahead of time. So they are brought solemnly to the gate of the tabernacle. So they're brought to the door or the gate of the tabernacle. And so the next thing that was done was that they were washed publicly. Now, this represents the purification that needed to happen. Then they were clothed with their priestly vestments. After the clothing, they were anointed and oil was poured on their heads. This was before any turban was put on. And they were literally saturated in this very special oil. And this was the oil of anointing. You'll read about it in the Psalms, the oil that flows over Aaron's beard. Okay. Moses puts an offering into their hands, and they have to wave this offering in the presence of God, indicating their willingness to praise and to worship, not only for themselves, but for everybody else. And then the offering is taken from them and it is sacrificed on the altar. So this whole process happens during these 7 days. And then, since Aaron and his sons are the same as everybody else, sacrifices have to be offered for them. So a bull was immolated as a sin offering, and 2 rams were offered as well. And one of them was offered and immolated as the consecration of these men. Consecration means that just as this ram is handed over completely into the divine presence, so we are handed over completely into the divine presence as well. And with the second ram, the blood of the second ram is sprinkled on Aaron and his robes, consecrating all the robes. And it was after this consecration that they then had the sacred meal. You remember I pointed this out to you on Mount Sinai, that it was only after the Holocaust and the signing of the covenant that Moses and Aaron and the elders were invited up into the presence of God to have a meal in his presence. Well, this sacred meal means that now these priests operate in heaven. They're operating in God's sphere, in God's presence. And so they have communion with the victim. Their communion with the victim indicates the completion of their consecration. So Aaron and his sons had some things to do. I said they were passive, but there was a couple of things they had to do. And one of them was they had to lay their hands on the victims that were offered in sacrifice for them. Now, the laying hands on the victim actually was passing your sin over onto this innocent victim and taking from the innocent victim the innocence that you need in order to operate in the presence of God. A very good physical demonstration of what happens spiritually to us when we convert and repent and come to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, receive all that Jesus has won for us on Calvary. We take it into ourselves. We take his innocence into us because he has given us the forgiveness of sin. So they had to identify themselves with the victim. And during the meal, they also ate the showbread for the first time. So that means that they are actually participating in taking the bread, as I pointed out to you before, that would point down prophetically to the Holy Communion that you and I receive. So there's just one more thing in this particular chapter which is extremely important, and that is that once the priests were consecrated, then Moses went to consecrate the altar of sacrifice, because now that you have a priesthood, you need an altar of sacrifice. And the altar of sacrifice was going to be taking all the victims, carrying all the sins of the nations on a daily basis. The altar needed to be consecrated and it needed to be anointed. And so this was done every single day of the 7 days. Okay. A bullock was offered for sin every day. This is what the instruction was. Thus you will cleanse the altar. Then you shall anoint the altar and sanctify it. And for 7 days you will make atonement for it and sanctify it, because from then on it will be a most holy altar, and anything that touches it will become holy. Now, because of lack of time, I can't go into that, but it was a very, very, very important point. And then there was to be a daily offering of 2 yearling lambs, morning and evening, so that the sacrifices for the sins of the people would continue perpetually. And of course, this points to the fact, as I said to you before, that the holy sacrifice of the Mass is offered continuously to keep God's grace and blessing flowing to sinful humanity. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht déileamh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram @Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.